So who am I? I'm the co-director for the Department of Online Prevention within Violence Prevention Network. Violence Prevention Network is a German NGO which was founded in 2004 and is mainly working in the field of prevention of extremism, intervention, and de-radicalization or exit work, mainly within prisons. So if you have any question about the organization, I can always also send you a flyer, but I think I will keep that part short and just talk about our department, the online department. So what we do is we do content creation within a certain project where we try to provide alternative content to Islamist narratives online. We work with different platform providers. We do a little bit of research and advisory. And of course, we're starting to do monitoring. And that's the topic of today for me, the monitoring, or how can we utilize monitoring within our work in PVE. So especially within the context of social media monitoring. There are two levels we have to think about. One is the qualitative and the other one is the quantitative level of monitoring. So on the quantitative side, we have an interest in who likes what, how many likes does which topic get. We can monitor YouTube, Instagram, all these social media platforms. And from a quantitative spectrum or point of view, it's very interesting to see which networks, which referral rates are there, how does which actor, for example, a Salafi or a right-wing extremism actor, posts how often, how many likes, comments does this content get. And this is a monitoring which can be made by machines. You can use crawlers to access public data, but it's not worth much without the context. So I will keep it very short, and I'm happy if we have questions afterwards. So we need the qualitative monitoring as well. And there we talk about monitoring which narratives are there, how do they get contextualized, is there an overlap from public events or whatever. So for example, the withdrawal of Afghanistan, it was very interesting to see on a quantitative level that it wasn't, not too many actors within the Islamist spectrum made videos about it at first. And from a qualitative spectrum, it was interesting to see that they didn't talk about Afghanistan, but more about their usual topics, just with another framing. So these two levels are very important to distinguish, and also we are trying to monitor not only within the German context, but also the worldwide context, because what we saw in our project was that a lot of times content which comes from Arabic-speaking or English-speaking countries gets picked up by German players within the extremist scene. And so it gives us the possibility to foresee or to anticipate certain developments and trends. But it's so the risks, and as many opportunities that are there, there are as many risks. And the biggest risk is to confuse big actors with dangerous actors. So especially if you try to look into violent extremism, the route you might take is, oh, okay, these actors have the most views, the most clicks, but they might not even promote violence actively, but there are some niche actors who do it much more, and you might be blinded by the fact that others have more likes, more content, whatever. It's very hard to build up capacities to monitor. So you have to have a good IT infrastructure. You need programmers, you need experts on a qualitative level to contextualize the data you get. So it's very important that we provide practitioners the needed knowledge how to interpret data. And I think a lot of times that doesn't happen. So you see, oh yeah, Generation Islam has so many likes, and everybody thinks, oh yeah, the worst. But maybe if you look for violent extremists, they aren't. I mean, they're still bad and they're still relevant. I don't want to say that, but yeah. And another factor is that you also have to, the danger is that you confuse who's relevant online and who's relevant offline. So the first time I encountered or I got the connection to social media was when I worked in prisons. And I think it was in the context of the Middle East context. I went to prison, and although they don't have access to social media, so no smartphone, no internet, I heard the same narratives I heard a week before on YouTube videos of certain extras. And that really made click with me that, okay, social media is important, even for people who don't have active access to it, because we can foreshadow the narratives which are spread. But there are certain actors who are more prevalent or more seeable publicly or on the internet. And we can't walk into that trap of thinking that because they are so big, more local or smaller actors are not relevant. So yeah, the biggest danger is basically the numbers themselves, as interesting as they might be. And I think I have to finish up here, just to give you an outlook. Besides social media, such as Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, we also have to think about news spheres, which might be connected. So a lot of platform providers are deplatforming extremist actors. They get deleted, their accounts get banned, and so they move to others. So what we can see right now is that gaming or gaming adjacent spheres are more and more important. We just looked at, for example, right-wing extremists on Steam, and you can very easily find groups which are connected to right-wing extremists online with an active user base, and we are currently looking into that field as well. And that's it. I would post 2 resources in the chat of our colleagues at Modus ZAD, which looked into YouTube, and there you can, it's in English, so they also write a monthly report on Islamist actors on YouTube for the BPB in Germany. But they also had 2 projects, and they have a report in English that we'll share in the chat for you.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to reflect a bit on what is now 15 years worth of intervention in this space, and seeing where changes have been and also where perhaps they're less prevalent. And I think one of the interesting discussions that we're seeing now, especially actually because of the topicality of gaming as a potential site of radicalization, is the question of masculinities. And really recognizing how male identities and what it means to be a man in modern society is being played out in different spaces than perhaps we had traditionally thought about. And I think that's one of the areas where gender mainstreaming has become more apparent, shall we say, and reflects some of the changes in the field over the past 15 years. I would also say that generally there's more of a willingness to engage with issues of gender within the professions, especially at the institutional level. So we're seeing increasing commitment from organizations like the VPN, like RAN, like the European Union itself and EU member states to engage meaningfully with gender mainstreaming and really looking at the potential gender differentiated outcomes of PVE activities. But there's still some way to go in relation to this. And one of the things that I am seeing is that we're much more aware of how gender influences the individual, right? So we can see how it might influence individual men participating online. We can see how it might influence individual women when they're looking at certain narratives that ISIS might put out about protecting their roles as mothers, for example, as a sacred identity. But what we're less good at seeing and less good at responding to is seeing how gender is more than simply informing either the radicalization process or indeed the roles that people might play within organizations, but seeing how it influences the group as a whole and seeing how gender ideologies influence the group as a whole. There was a really interesting piece this week in the New York Times, I think, that was kind of saying ideology is not important. And gender ideology is not important. And And I think this is incredibly short-sighted as a mechanism for understanding the group as a whole, because it fails to really think about how gender ideologies legitimize the broader operations and activities of the group. And so if we're really serious about PVE beyond the level of the individual, so not just exit work, not just the stopping individuals, but collectively is how do we limit the groups, then we really need to engage with their gender ideology at the level of the group. And the other area where perhaps we could take our analysis a little bit further is also looking at the level of the cause, which is like another layer up, if you will. So the structural level. So where we can see some of the, what we might traditionally call push factors, operating in a gendered way, and not looking at how gender is differently affects people. And indeed the cause is again missing a point. So to give you an example, when we think about how extremist groups utilize violations of women's rights to further their cause, right? So when the state is seen to objectify women in particular ways or participate in crimes against women, in sexual-based violence, for example, then the groups will use that as a way of justifying and legitimizing the cause overall. So again, us not looking at this broader level, I think, is missing opportunities, and also giving space to extremist groups to create alternative gender ideologies and narratives that tie into their framing of the world, which I think is problematic. One of the consequences of this kind of not looking at the group and not looking at the structure is, I think sometimes we might have missed a trick when it comes to security sector reform. And I say this particularly in the UK at the moment, when we're looking at the recent prosecution and conviction of the murder of Sarah Everett by a police officer, and the misogyny that was presented both within his particular unit, his network, and also his own identities. I think that unless we also look at our own institutions and our own practices, and looking at how we may do better to ensure gender mainstreaming ourselves, I think we're always going to fall short when we try and respond to the inequalities and the violence and the gender-based violence that extremist groups also perpetuate. So I suppose it's a two-way thing. We need to see it in others and also recognize our own shortcomings.
I want to ask you, how will we see the future?
What we see online is that the scenes are more diversified, but there are still strong networks. There are still very active scenes, but they work on another level. So I think IS is not that representative of an example, but and we had people going to war zones before. We will have them afterwards, I guess. But I think the time of these big, at least for the German context, what we can see is that even non-violent groups are not that public anymore, but they are still there. They might not be in the streets with the Lease campaign or the Read campaign, but they are online, they are on TikTok, and offline, of course, as well. But they diversify, they are not that recognizable anymore for easy consumption by the public eye, let's say it like that. But they're still there, and I think there's still a risk. It's not like the Islamist sector is going away, but it changes.
You say that some of these organizations go more underground, and I was wondering if you know why they go underground. Is it because they can't go and surf on the waves of ISIS or Daesh or any other big organization anymore, because they have been deplatformed, and those other organizations try to enforce that propaganda, and now they have to do it themselves, but it's a bit harder and it needs more organization? Could it be that they are a bit lost online, and that's why they are not so active anymore?
An example we had it's not like a scientific example right now, but more experience from our project, that certain players which only are in a niche spectrum, so they might only prey on Discord and not that often, are connected with groups that are very public, but more, let's say, they have a broader agenda. They can bring more people in, and they've work as a like reference to these smaller actors, to these niche actors that go deeper. So certain actors do only Telegram groups or Signal chats, and it's almost impossible to get in there if you only rely on publicly available material. Or they do. We saw a flyer for a workshop for women online, and you had to call them and verify that you are actually a woman, and that's really hard to get access to for an NGO.
I think they've become much more secretive and paranoid. I think in the past, outsiders were always potential recruits. And now outsiders are potential recruits or potential spies or just journalists. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of perspective on them as well, that they've closed down, and maybe recruitment isn't such a big part. One of the areas that I think is really interesting is the role of cities and the role of place within these networks. So I know with the online space, everyone thinks of it as being this kind of amorphous, deterritorialized operating platform where anyone from anywhere around the world can just jump on in. But how important is geography and place to these networks? Do we find like they're city-based in the same way, even though they're all online, or is there something else going on?
I think that's an excellent question for more research. That's a very fascinating topic, and we're just beginning, and we're a little bit late, but we're just beginning to grab the extent and to understand not online versus offline, but hybrid social worlds for young people especially.
I don't think we should even talk about how does this influence each other. I think there's just no online and offline anymore for us, our generation. It is normal that we have like an online life and an offline life, but for the digital natives, like they say, who grow up with it, they don't make this distinction anymore. Sorry, from my experience is that the content that you see online, or the symbols, the dog whistles, the signs that they use online, they also use it offline. If you look at the protest of the 6th of January of this year in Washington, you saw a lot of signs that you can find, or till then only find on the internet, flags, logos, but on that day, they brought it to the manifestation on a banner or on a pin, on whatever. So I think even extremist organizations are not making the distinction between online and offline anymore.
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, what I find interesting is that we can still see some extent of privacy. So that might be the better distinction. So we see that the content which is being put out there leads to offboarding processes, to either individual chats, to real life meetings. So going from a very public space to a more private space. Especially women are active in that.
Actually today, this morning, the Danish government brought home 3 Danish women citizens with 15 kids from the Al-Hol camp, and actually, as I see it, the women, the mothers, will be present, and now the work will start up, and I'm very excited to see what will happen from now on, the sentences, and then the exit programs, rehabilitation, not only for the mothers but also for the children, to look in what does we confront with these kids. How are they? It's going to be a very complex work for authorities.
And I think a long-term project, long-term issue as well. I think there's been some amazing work with the initial repatriation. So I think about all of the hard work that the different governments have done and others to enable some women and children to return. But it's that what happens in the long term? What are we doing in 2 or 3 years? And how do we balance people's right to a private life and normality with this fear that they may always be at risk of radicalization if they're especially as children. Like I see it in the media, this idea of them being the cubs of the caliphate, sleeper cells, ticking time bombs, all this kind of rhetoric around these young children who are in law victims. And so I think there's this long-term question of balancing those children's normality with this quest for surveillance and supervision that the state might have.
I think these children and families, whatever their ideological ideas are at this stage, I think they're facing a great stigma, which may make it really difficult for them to properly reintegrate into the society. Maybe at the first glance, maybe they have an apartment, maybe they have the economical support, maybe they have support from their family or relatives, but the situation can change really drastically even within a few months, and maybe suddenly they may be out of support network, and then we have a situation where they are maybe in a vulnerable situation for being drawn back into the group, the extremist group.
I think that's a real worry especially for women, because we don't have it so well developed for women's networks and responding to their needs. So I think there's a reasonably well-established kind of formers network for men, but it's much less well-developed for women. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider, is where do women go to, especially if they're used to gender segregated spaces. So again, we have to think about how these barriers kick in ways that we might not always see for men. And also some of the reporting is that women are not finding support from their family when they return in the same way that men in the past might have done. And I think that's a really interesting kind of dynamic to work through, that actually the women are seen to shame the community even more than men did. The response I usually get from practitioners is it's on a case-by-case basis. It's an individual ad hoc thing. We respond to the person in front of us, which goes back to my earlier point about we're quite good at responding to individuals, but that's quite a gender blind approach. And it means that some of the planning, some of the institutional resources, some of the structures aren't in place for women, because it's assumed that what was in place for men will instantly work for women. And so, yeah, on the one hand, people say, oh, we respond on a case-by-case basis, but when a woman comes with gender-specific requirements, suddenly you have to go scrabbling around to hunt for the thing that's going to fit, because we haven't planned for it, we haven't thought about it, especially for the long term. So I think there's quite a bit more planning to do to think through some of the gender-specific needs of women and children returning.
How maybe, if there are any links between the Incell movement and Islamist extremism as well. I mean, I would think maybe misogyny could be a common denominator, but this was something I was wondering about, because there seems to be this new movement growing where you would think that there could be some overlap.
I think it's really interesting, but I think the major challenge is how women are viewed. Both groups, I think, present women into certain categories. They're either categories that you're either on a pedestal for being the perfect wife, and the perfect mother, and the perfect whichever version of the ideology that you're wandering on, or you're enemy women, which is often tied to women's promiscuity. So the presumption is that women's sexuality is the problem, and so I think there is a similarity there in this binary presentation of women. But what I get the impression with the incel movement, although I'm less familiar with it, is that there are far fewer women that get on the pedestal category. They're like the problem is that there are no more women left on this category, hence why they can't, why they are involuntary celibate in their terms, right? But there's still the idea that women should be on this pedestal. Whereas within extremist Islamist groups, there's certainly a category of women that definitely fit on this pillar. on this pedestal, and then there's all the other women. So I think it's this kind of policing of women's bodies that is common.
They trust in you with their lives, and they will share every little thing in their life with you. And as a professional first line practitioner, it's very hard to give you as a person working so close with people. It had a big cost for me, I can say.
I think what's really important is looking after first line practitioners and the networks, and making sure that there's a support within your institutions as well for this kind of a work, because there's emotional labor involved. And I think it's that emotional labor that doesn't always get recognized. Like, we can count up the overtime, but when the WhatsApp comes in at midnight, how do you measure that? And especially if it's an emotive one, you know, that's not something that institutions can easily deal with. But I think as well, with some of the things, it requires a shift maybe in how the professions think about themselves, so they can also look after each other.
You have like collegial support but an understanding that you talk about it.
I really think this discussion is extremely important. There is definitely a need to speak more about that, and to kind of create mechanisms and support networks to support each other. And I mean, RAN is a perfect example of that, where you meet each other and you can exchange experiences.
Recently in the OSINT community, they have been very aware of what it means to work from home, not seeing anyone anymore, not being able to talk about what you see, and not being able to cope with it, to talk about it to other people. So there have been a few podcasts and a few articles on this topic where they share great links. So it's really worth checking out the link in the article